Hello, and welcome to this session on Spring Boot Omakase, the Configuration and Deployment Edition. My name is Mark Heckler. I'll get into more about me just briefly in a moment, but just first, if you have any questions, comments, or feedback after this session, you can reach me via email. These are the two of my many email addresses, the two that I check the least infrequently. I do check them from time to time, but email is not necessarily my favorite way of communicating. The place I spend most of my time is on Twitter. So if you have any questions, comments, or feedback, you want to reach me, the level best way is to ping me on Twitter. If you're not following me on Twitter already, I guess the first question is why? Why? Anyway, if you are, that's great. If you're not, please do follow me at MKHeck, as on the screen there. And if you have any questions, comments, feedback that you want to share publicly, by all means, just tweet them. If you want to not necessarily share them with the whole world, my DMs are open as well. So follow me and shoot me a direct message, and I'll gladly respond. So a bit about me, and I don't want to belabor this point, but I am an author. I've co-authored a couple of books. I've contributed content and code to several other books, and I have another book coming out, which I'll mention briefly momentarily. I am an architect and developer, and as you might surmise from my from the next bullet point, where most of my expertise has been won, it's been in the JVM ecosystem. I am a Java champion, Java 1 rockstar, groundbreaker ambassador, Google developer expert in Kotlin, so I'm very fond of Java and Kotlin. I can't choose a favorite child, but anyway, great languages, great ecosystem, right? I am a Spring developer and advocate. I work for VMware on the Spring team. I get to write code. I like to develop Spring applications. I commit code, and I like to as well just talk. So that's kind of why I'm here. It's kind of the ideal gig for me. I am also the sole creator and curator of Spring Noticias en Español. It was an area I felt I could help in because I do speak Spanish, even worse than English, but thanks for your patience with me here today. But if you have Spanish language resources that you want to share with a greater Spanish-speaking community in terms of Spring or Java, Kotlin, Gradle, Groovy, Maven, by all means, share them with me, and I will happily share them with the community. Also, at Spring Noticias is the Twitter handle. I am also a pilot, a licensed pilot, believe it or not. It's amazing the trust that folks will extend to you sometimes. But I jokingly say I got my license because, right now nobody will fly me around. Actually, that had been a lifelong goal of mine. I finally just did complete it several months ago. So yeah, kind of happy about that. Anyway, onward and upward. I do have a Spring Boot up and running book that's coming out here soon. I've just got to wrap it up now and put the finishing touches on it. It's available for early access. If you'd like to know more, check out the link below, bit.ly/springbootbook. That will take you to the O'Reilly site, which gives you early access to the first several chapters of that book for your perusal, no charge. And once it comes out, of course, you can buy it at your favorite online bookseller, bookstore, through O'Reilly if you have a Safari book subscription, what have you. But check it out. I like to cover the introductory topics as well as get into some of the more interesting topics that come up repeatedly when it comes to just kind of coming up to speed in different areas, different topic areas within the Spring Boot ecosystem as a whole. So anyway, so the plan for today. Yeah, I like this quote by Mike Tyson, as violent as it is. Everybody has a plan until they get punched in the mouth. Hopefully there will be no mouth punching today. However, I do have a plan. Hopefully we'll try to stick to it. And if not, well, we'll have a good time meandering, right? But the plan is to start off talking configuration and to dive into deployment. Now, how do these two relate? Actually, there have been many ways and are many ways to interact with your environment from your Spring Boot application. And I think this is very important because no application is an island, right? Every application should be able to interact with its surroundings, its environment around it. So I like to kind of dive into that and show the different ways that Spring Boot can interact with its external circumstances, if you will. And then that naturally leads into deployment, how Spring Boot applications are deployed into their external environment. So I start off, we'll talk about how configuration is good for the environment, right? It's good for your app too, to know where it's executing and be able to interact with its external circumstances. You do have options. There are many ways to interact with an environment from your Spring Boot application. And I'll show you a few of those and talk about pros and cons. And again, I show things through code because I think it makes a lot more sense when you see something versus when you hear conceptually how it should work. So we'll dive into the code and I'll kind of narrate as I go there. I also changed the name to protect the innocent. That's actually a useful feature when it comes to reserved words, but it's also kind of a useful feature in certain limited and very specific, but certainly very important use cases. So I like to cover that as well. I think it's a great feature. We'll do some deployments. We'll talk about the executable jars, truly executable jars that Spring Boot can produce. And then we'll expand those. We'll talk about putting them into containers and deploying them to a variety of platforms. But of course, Kubernetes is kind of the platform, right? And we'll talk about how this will work and how natural a fit that Spring Boot is in terms of sliding right into a K8s environment. So with that, let's code. For those of you who don't know this gentleman, this is Maurice Moss from the IT Crowd. If you've never watched the IT Crowd, it's a Britcom. It's on Netflix. Check it out. Okay, so with no further ado, 6 minutes in and we're off to code. That's a good run here. So let's start here. This is the Spring Initializer. This is typically your launching pad for creating Spring Boot based applications, Spring Boot microservices, large apps, small apps, anything in between, right? Now, you don't have to create Spring Boot applications from the Spring Initializer. It's a great place to go to do that, though. So you can create your own handcrafted, bespoke, artisanal Spring Boot applications and do it all completely by hand, right? Completely manually. You can write every character of code manually. Not the best use of your time, admittedly, but you can do it. If you're a glutton for punishment, why use any kind of helpful tool at all? Probably shouldn't even use an editor, should just capture things from the terminal straight from the command line, right? No, but you can, right? However, the Spring Initializer was created to make your life easier, to make my life easier, to make all of our lives easier as developers, to kind of accelerate us on the path toward developer superpowers. Now, if you want to use the Initializer to leverage it without coming to the web page, and as you can see here, the URL is start.spring.io, famous and often imitated launching pad for creating applications of various different kinds. But certainly you don't have to go here in your browser. You can curl it. You can HTTP this endpoint. You can access this via a number of different IDEs. You can do all of those things. And the nice thing about it is, since Spring Initializer exposes its API, it's all going to the same place. And the application, the application that you're downloading, the project that you're downloading, I should say, is consistent. It's the same. So whether you go and create the application, create the project, I should say, in your IDE, or whether you curl it or HTTP it, or if you come here, it's consistently built the same way, which is super, super, super nice, right? As well as incredibly helpful when it comes to making consistent artifacts across a team, for instance. But I like to come here for a couple of reasons. I like to go to the web page because it is, it's nice to look at, right? I also like the little features that we've thrown in here. Our Initializer team has thrown in here. So if you have the bright mode, that's fine. That works. It just blends in with the rest of your many, many tabs that you have open. If you are a dark mode person like I am, that's great too, because it's a little jarring if you have everything in dark mode and then you pop up another tab and open the site and bam. So I think that's kind of nice and useful. It's a small creature feature, but it's nice. There's also an exploration button down here, and I'll show you that momentarily, but that's a kind of an extra nice feature that you don't get via your IDE or via curling the command line. So nice extra there. So I'm going to just start out, I guess, just a brief bit of information about Spring Boot. Spring Boot actually elevates the conversation from a gazillion different dependencies. If you've done Java development and many other language developments for a long time, you will bring in a lot of dependencies, a lot of libraries, just to provide a handful of capabilities. And for years, we kind of accepted that as the way to do it because it was the only way to do it, or predominant way to do it anyway. So if we wanted to provide a single capability, we had to have this library and that library and that library. Library B actually depended on library C, which depended on libraries D, E, F, and X. And then you have this massive tree built out of libraries that are dependent on other libraries. And you have to include every one of those in your build file. And to make things more interesting, of course, each one of those has a version. And version 3 of library B may not work with version 7 of library C. And you have to keep track of all that. And that gets really, really cumbersome. It's a huge time sink. So what Spring did is elevate the conversation, right? There are dependencies. There are starter POMs, which include at a higher level a certain dependency. So if you want to create a web service, let's say a RESTful API, RESTful web API, you are going to need certain things, right? You need to have some way to listen on a port, to respond to requests, or to accept requests, I should say, to start off with, to route those requests to a particular method, to respond with a particular type of response, to format that a certain way. So you've got, and that's just kind of a quick summary, but even among those things, you can see that there would be potentially several libraries and functionalities built into just doing, quote, one thing. By elevating the conversation to a starter POM for a web service, then you have one thing to keep track of, and it keeps your build file much, much cleaner. This synchronization of versions is another huge help, because all of these versions of all these different dependent libraries are tested together. So while you still can override those should need be, in many cases you don't. In most cases you don't. And you know they will work together because they have been exhaustively tested together, which takes a lot of headaches and time sinks off of your plate, so you can focus on the stuff you want to do, which is write code to make your customers and users more productive. Nice, right? So with the initializer, it doesn't generate code, it generates your project. But actually, it does create the main application class main method, so it's 3 or 4 lines. But everything is just kind of set up for you to get a running start on your code. So let's get that running start, right? So I'm going to just choose a few dependencies to bring in here and just set up my project with some very basic information. You do have options. So if you are a Maven developer, if you prefer to use Maven as your build system, that's great. You can create a Maven project. If you're a hipster, you can create a Gradle project. I'm not wearing my hoodie. I know you can't see me right now, but I'm not wearing a hoodie right now. I'm just, my t-shirt and jeans. So yeah, I'm not feeling the hipster, so I'll just stay with Maven. But if you prefer Gradle, you can use Gradle. You can use Java, Kotlin, or Groovy. I'm going to stay with Java today, but again, do what makes you happy, right? Happy little trees. And I'm going to use, actually, I'm going to go ahead on up to 2.4.0.milestone 2 of Spring Boot, because there's something. I'm not sure we'll have time to get to it today, but I'll mention it if not. Typically I stay with the current version of Spring Boot, and that gets you everything we probably will be able to cover today, but just in case, I'm going to bump it on up to a milestone release. And I'm going to just change the group name to the hecklers.com, because why not? Certainly we can do that. And I'm going to call this my boot demo. So let's call this Omakase. Demo. Yeah, let's do that. That sounds nice, right? I'm going to use jar for the packaging because that gets us our executable jar. Means we don't have to have a bunch of dependencies external like war files typically rely on, which again kind of comes back to bundling, bringing all your toys and your tools with you, which gives you full control over those. Again, consistent versions, and makes things a little neater. It also gives us some ability to do something here down the road, which I'll mention in more detail and show you as we go. But the nice thing about an Uber jar or an executable jar, as Spring Boot creates them, is they're not shaded jars, right? So many times when you hear about an Uber jar, you hear about shading, and shading has a few problematic bits, right? One is that with shading, you may have some version conflicts, and when you kind of tease things apart, how do you know that this version of a dependency won't conflict with this other version of a dependency? And while those mechanisms are in place to kind of handle that, in most cases it does bring up some questions, right? And some challenges. It also can bring some issues when it comes to licensing, because if a particular library is licensed in a way that conflicts with another particular library, that can be problematic when you kind of tease them apart into their component pieces and remix them. It also can cause license violations in certain cases if there's a license that says you can freely redistribute this particular library, but only if it remains unchanged. And when you start shading that and teasing out and reassembling, that's not unchanged. So that may be problematic. It may not, but it's certainly something to keep in mind. With Spring Boot, I think our original developers and designers of this came up with a great idea, which is, what if we could nest jars and leave them unmodified in their original configuration? Which opens up a lot of possibilities. One, it doesn't violate any kind of licensing, doesn't even potentially violate it. And the other thing is it gives us some neat capabilities, which I will show you down the road today, in terms of what happens when we containerize these applications, what happens when we want to maybe rehydrate these applications and expand them out. So again, keeping that in mind, we'll still go with jar packaging. That's just the way to go. Now, whether we want to do Java 11, Java 8, Java 14, 8 is the baseline for Spring Framework 5.x and Spring Boot 2.x, everything up from that. 11 is a current long-term supported version of Java, of course, and 14 is the current version of Java as of this moment. And that's fine. We'll stay with Java 11 for the time being, but whichever way you go, it's all fully supported. Now, I'm going to add some dependencies here. I'm going to, again, choose Spring Web, as I mentioned earlier, which tells you right there, you can build web, including RESTful applications using Spring MVC. Tomcat is the default embedded container, but you can swap that out. We won't need to swap that out today, but it's nice to know that capability is there. I'm going to also bring in Actuator as a dependency, which gives us our production-ready capabilities that lets us see what's going on in our application live and in real time. We may come back to that. Hopefully we'll have time. If not, again, the repo is there, so I'll share it with you. Lombok gives you a way to reduce boilerplate code. It allows me to concentrate on things I really want to without writing pages and pages of getters, setters, equals hashcode toString methods, things like that. And then I'm going to bring in my configuration processor dependency. And what this allows us to do is do some really cool things with configuration properties, which we will get to. That's actually, I think, coming up pretty quickly. So I told you I would show you how to explore the project, and this is a very nice capability. Small feature, but super useful feature in Spring Initializer, because it lets you, before you download it, explore your project. So you can get in and look at the things that are within your project. Specifically useful, of course, is your structure, which is kind of nice, but mostly, really, when it gets down to it, is mostly this build file. So whether this is Gradle or in this case it's Maven, you can see exactly what dependencies are coming in, what your plugins are, where your repositories are, what have you. So this is super, super useful to let you kind of take a quick peek and make sure you have everything the way you want it prior to getting the, downloading, unzipping, and opening in your IDE this project. So I'm going to generate the project, and we will save this to our desktop. And I'm just going to open that up and pop that up in our favorite IDE, NetBeans. Ha! Kidding. No, NetBeans is a great IDE. Eclipse. We have a version of Eclipse called the Spring Tool Suite. I mean, there are a lot of great IDEs out there, as well as options for creating Spring Boot applications. I use IntelliJ. I kind of joke with my friends. But I use IntelliJ because I do some Kotlin writing of some Kotlin code, and IntelliJ works really well for that because JetBrains makes IntelliJ, and JetBrains also leads development of Kotlin. So that makes it kind of nice, as you might imagine. So I'm going to. I guess I should just show you the POM, and as you can see, everything is there as we expected it to be, fairly straightforward there. I'm going to go to my application properties, which is a file within Spring Boot applications which lets us define kind of sensible defaults, right? So properties that we can use in our Spring Boot application. We can override these with our external environmental configurations, which I will be showing you again momentarily as well. But for starters, we're going to just assign some values in here, and we will use them in our code. So let's see here. So I'm going to just create a couple of properties. So anytime you do a demo, you have to come up with an idea of something that, interests you, interests the audience. And I, as anybody who knows me knows, I love a good cup of coffee. And I like hot tea too. Last time when I tend to talk about this stuff. I talk effusively about coffee. One time somebody said, hey, look, stop talking so much about coffee. I like hot tea. Well, so do I. So I thought, let's think about this. Let's widen the loop a bit. So let's do hot beverages, right? So I'm going to, we're just going to talk in terms of beverage, but again, I'll still probably lean a bit more toward coffee. So I'm going to define a property here called beverage name. And beverage is kind of the higher level grouping, but name is the specific property name. So beverage.name. And I'm going to assign a beverage brew method, and we'll say that this is just a pour over, right? So this is one way to make a coffee. And now let's go to our code. Whoops, let's see, code. There we go. All right. So in order to test this out and just kind of show you some cool stuff to get rolling, I'm going to create a REST controller. And this is just a controller, a Spring MVC controller that returns an object in itself versus embedding it in some type of a template file or a formatted file, right? So I'm going to assign this a request mapping for a base mapping, and we'll call this our beverage endpoint to start with. And this will be our, let's see, our beverage controller. Typing is a thing. Okay. So I'm going to assign a get mapping here. And of course, get mapping restricts it just to gets. And I'm going to add on name. So this is additive, right? So we start with our http://localhost : in this case, 8080 is the default for Spring Boot applications, /beverage /name, right? So we'll return a string here, and we'll say the string is get name. Yeah. So what is the name? Well, let's define what our name is. So private string name. We'll call this beverage name. Name. Yeah, that's fine. And private string beverage brew method, right? Brew. That's just going to be too cumbersome. So brew method. Yeah, let's just keep it short and sweet. So I'll go to name. Yeah, that's fine. All right. Now we have values set up in our application.properties, right? So we're going to use @value, and we're going to go to our beverage.name to grab the value of that. Now, this is what's called Spring Expression Language, and you just put the name of the property in here, and then it references that same property here, right, or wherever it may find it. In this case, it's here. So I'm going to do the same thing here. Oops, let's see. And we're going to do that here, but this will be our beverage brew method. So here on our get name, we can just return our name. And then if we want to also be able to get our brew method for an endpoint, string get brew method, return brew method. All right, so let's run that. Give me a chance to take a drink and soothe my screaming throat here. Okay, so there we go. All right, so I use HTTP instead of curl because it gives you some neat little shortcut opinions, like instead of typing in localhost 8080, well, if you don't specify a host name, it assumes localhost, so that's kind of nice, right? Oops, HTTP. Can't see around my microphone. I'm making silly typos here. So beverage /name. And there we see we have the beverage name of coffee. So now if we do a brew method, we see that the brew method for coffee is pour over. So that's great. Everything seems to be working, but we can fix it. Have no fear. Now, this particular way of extracting values and assigning them to two different variables here is super useful and very flexible, right? What we can also do is assign default values in case something is missing, right? So if I put beverage name and I say rack Tagino for any Star Trek Deep Space Nine fans out there, you'll know what a rack Tagino is. If not, you need to watch DS9. But anyway, okay. So what this tells you is that if beverage name as a variable can't be found, use this instead. So that's kind of nice. Now, if it can find beverage name, if your application can't find it, nothing happens, right? No bad things happen. It's just ignored. It just uses coffee. But I'm going to comment this out so we can see what happens. Now, I'm going to show you a couple of interesting things momentarily that happens, but this is a fairly innocuous way to start off. Go ahead and restart the application. And we go here. So I will grab the name, and now we see that it's a Ractagino. Nothing changed with the brew method, though. We still have a pour over, which seems really odd for a Klingon coffee, but okay, that's fine. So everything is working very, very nicely. Now, what I can also do is set up a default value for this. So instead of if beverage brew method isn't found, what I can do is say, let's see, we'll say that this brew method is a bespoke, and we'll say $. Let's see, so we'll say bespoke beverage.name. So that's kind of a brew method. We're going to have a bespoke Ractagino, right? So let's try that. And we'll see something very interesting happen momentarily, something very uncomfortable, right? We're using one variable from within another variable, which is pretty cool, right? Except there are limitations, as with all things. We can see here injection of auto-wired dependencies failed. The nested exception is so on and so forth. The problem is, of course, that it couldn't resolve the placeholder beverage name in the value beverage brew method bespoke beverage name. Now, why is that? Well, if you recall here, this is commented out. And so when we try to refer to this beverage name, it can't find it. Now, we have a default value set up here, but that's just to kind of substitute in if it also can't find it. So it doesn't create beverage.name when it uses this. It says, hey, if I can't find this, use this. But now it once again says, I can't find this. Well, we can do this. We can assign a variable, or excuse me, a default value here, Ractagino, spelling his thing. And when I restart this, that works. All right, so let's try this. Brew method, boom. So we're back to pour over. Oh, I forgot to actually comment this out too. Okay, so let's try that again. Because, of course, it doesn't even pull this up and show it unless it can't find beverage.brew method. So we're back up and running. Bespoke Ractagino. So that works. But you can see there might be a problem here because if you put a beverage name here of Earl Grey hot, right? So let's do that again. In this case, I'm providing two different default values for beverage name, and that can lead to some kind of crazy, wild inconsistencies, and that's probably not what we're after. So we've got that for our brew method, but if we check name, then this doesn't work, right? So this gives you a ton of flexibility. However, it may not be what you're after necessarily because you can easily get yourself in trouble, and it's the flexibility which gives it some of its power actually can give it some of its frustrations as well. So, and this is one other thing I do want to point out. Since these variable names, or excuse me, these property names are never really referenced anywhere except within strings, our IDE doesn't know if they're even used. It can't type check, it can't use check. So it's not maybe as full featured as we might like, right? So there is a better way. I'm going to just comment these things out. So there is a better way, or at least a newer, more capable way, and that is to maybe, that is to use something in Spring Boot called configuration properties. So that gives us a bit more to play with here. So I'm going to create a class, and I'm going to call this class hot beverage. And let's see, I want a string name and a brew method, right? Brew method. All right. And I'm going to define this as a configuration properties class. And we'll say that the prefix is beverage. Beverage, spelling is a thing. Now, it will tell you, and this is a super nice thing, it just, let's see. Come on. There we go. Much better. your IDE will tell you, look, this is not registered via @enable configuration properties. It's not marked as a Spring component, and it's not scanned via configuration properties scan. The easy way to fix this, and I feel like the best way to fix this in most cases, is to just, since you have a Spring Boot application which includes a component scan, if you go in and look here, let's see, so that's bytecode. We won't dig into that, but there's a component scan from a Spring Boot application. We can also make this do a configuration properties scan as well. So that takes care of that issue, as you can see. All right. So let's see. So I do want to give this make this an @data class for Lombok. So we have our getters and setters equals hashcode and toString methods, and then we should be able to inject this, right? So private final. So this was a hot beverage, right? Beverage. Nope. Beverage, edge, typing, yes. Now, we need to inject this in order to be able to use this. I'm going to use Lombok once again to provide an all-args constructor. This just instructs Lombok to create a constructor with a parameter for each member variable for a class, and this just has one, right? So it'll provide that, which is kind of nice. And instead of name, I'll just say beverage dot get name, and here we have beverage dot get brew method. Now, if we look here, let's see. Let me just get rid of that. Beverage dot. Oh, I need to do one thing first, right? I need to compile this because that enables my configuration properties, right? So let's see. Why did that not build? Build, not project. There we go. Okay, so now if I go here, beverage.name, and we can see that it actually knows that it's a string in this case. So that gives us some use checking and type checking. So we've got our so brew method, and we'll just say this is we'll use our arrow press. Why not? Let's go fancy. So we have our name and our brew method defined. We're usage checking, we're type checking. Let's go ahead and restart this and see if I covered all the bases here. Okay, so let's go ahead and run this. Beverage name, coffee, brew method, AeroPress. Okay, so that elevates things just a little bit, right? It gives us a few more capabilities. Now, one other thing that I find incredibly useful about this is the ability to change a name, which I think is super nice. Super necessary at times if you have some kind of a reserved word conflict. But in certain cases, this is just kind of useful anyway, right? So I'm going to just create a constructor here. So I'm going to public hot beverage and string name and string brew method. And let's see. So this dot name equals name. This dot brew method equals brew method. Now, if I want to change this name, or I need to change this name, so let's do this, and we'll call this name just brew, right? So now, oh, I do need to add constructor binding to indicate that it should bind these variables directly through the constructor, which allows us to take advantage of this. So now, what this does is allow me to, let's see if I can rebuild this. Recompile. There we go. So now if I go here, is it still brew method? No. Look at that. How nice. So we'll go back to our pour over. Pour over. Oh, we'll do a Chemex. Yeah, why not? Okay. Yeah, it's still basically a pour over. Anyway. Okay, so let's go ahead and restart this. Good to have options. And then I want to show you one more thing really quickly, and then we'll launch into our deployment options and we'll wrap it up. Yeah, not immediately. It'll take us a little while to get through that, but I want to keep leaning into it. So here's our beverage name, coffee. Once again, our brew method is Chemex. So everything is working brilliantly, as we might expect, and we're using a much more friendly, in this case, than a brew method. We just shorten it to brew, name and brew. Nice, clean. Now, Another thing that that Spring Boot's configuration properties give you is the ability to interact with third-party libraries, third-party options. So if you have a third-party option, something that you're bringing in from an external library, you can expose its properties as configuration properties as well. Now, I don't have one of those here, so I'm just going to quickly just create a an example here that we can use as a proxy, if you will. So I'm going to create a beverage supplier. Now I'm going to say that we have a string name and a private string. Let's go with location. That should work. Okay, so I want to, again, make this an @data class for Lombok, so it'll create my getter setters equals hashcode and toString methods. And then if we were injecting this from external sources, for instance, again, we're not, but that's a shame, right? So we're going to make this a configuration properties, and we'll say our prefix is supplier. And let's see, so we'll create, if you will, a beverage supplier, supplier, return new beverage supplier. Right, okay. So let's go ahead and rebuild that. And then if we go back here, so our supplier, we now have a supplier name and supplier location property. Again, type checked. So supplier name, we'll call this, we'll say this is Tess's Tea Haven. And supplier location is Tivana. What better place to go than Tivana, right? All right. So let's, I need to create some way to check this, right? Check this before we wreck this. So I'm going to create another REST controller, another request mapping. We'll call this supplier and class supplier controller. Get mapping. We'll just leave it like that. We'll return actually a supplier, beverage supplier. Let's see. Get supplier return, and we have to have something to return, right? So we'll inject our beverage supplier here, supplier, and once again at all constructor for Lombok, and we'll return our supplier. Look at that. Okay, super useful. Oh, I just remembered something that let's see. Oh, yes. Well, yeah, I probably should do this, right? No args constructor. Yeah. And we'll rerun that. Supplier controller required a bean of beverage supplier. Oh, well, I started to do this, I think, and then I skipped right over it. I need to make this a bean, don't I? Yes, look at that. That should work considerably better. That seems a little happier, so that's a good sign. All right, so let's go to our supplier and just check to make sure that we're getting our supplier through there. Boom. Okay, so we're doing okay there. Now, I do want to show you that you can actually pull in environment information, because it's kind of the whole point, right? So let me kill that there and stop the process. Stop the presses. There we go. So now what I want to do is just do a clean package. Normally I show this a couple different ways, but I do want to make sure I have enough time for the deployment part. So I'm going to kind of zip through this. So what I can do is set up a, for instance, if I wanted to do a export supplier underscore name equals Carlos. Actually, I'm going to have to quote this. Carlos's cafe. Yeah. Super good stuff. And let's see, the supplier name is Colombia, or supplier name, location. I actually got to visit, due to a good friend of mine in Medellin, Colombia, visit a coffee farm there, which was awesome. So let's see, we'll call this Colombia. Make sure I keep rolling instead of just stopping to talk. But if you ever get a chance to do that, do that. It is life-changing. So I'm going to point back to that now. So, and we're going to use our Omakase. And I'm just running this. But Spring Boot has an order of precedence, and when you have internal properties that you've defined, those are kind of your sensible defaults, but you can override those. And it makes a lot of sense because when you deploy into various different environments, you need some way to override with the particulars in that environment, right? That makes sense for that environment. So if we run http://8080/supplier, now we will pick up Carlos's Café, right? Or Café de Carlos, if you prefer. So that's great. We've overridden that as it is. Now I'm going to leave those defined in the environment, right? Because I'm going to show you another area or another order of precedence. I'm going to just set supplier.name equals, let's see, so it would be, let's see, Coco's Cocoa, right? Why not? And then, well, that's all right. I don't need to add the location. We'll say that also comes from Colombia. Why not, right? So if we go back here to our supplier, we can see that Coco's Cocoa comes through. And this shows you that there is a definite order of precedence. I've shown you 3. The internal, of course, is overridden by anything external. And your command line parameters override even your environment variables, because that's the way to override everything, right? But there are several different stops along the way that give you different options as well, different ways and steps that you can override in an order of precedence that is very rigorous and makes a lot of sense, right? It's very logical. Okay. So I do want to show, I won't, I'm just going to skip over the making jars truly executable. It's a very small step, but it takes a bit of time, and I have that in my repo as well. But what I do want to show you is how you can use, how you can expand the different, the Spring Boot executable jar. So I'm going to make a directory. We'll call this expanded or just exp, and we'll cd into that. And I'm going to jar-xf, and we'll go to our target, Omakase, and we're going to expand that here. So we've just expanded our jar. And if we look, if we do a tree, we can see that we have our jars right there, and they're completely unmodified, right? So that's what I was telling you earlier. It gives you some very real possibilities to do some cool stuff because it's a very simple expansion to get back to a original state of all these different jars. And then, of course, since they're expanded, we can go ahead and just do a Java org loader and jar launcher, and we can start up our application super fast, super easy, even with it all expanded. So that is super useful as well. Now, where this comes into being really well, I mean, you can, when you deploy to containers, you can leave everything as a single executable jar, and that's fine. It's been done many times. It'll be done many times again. But expanding it, you actually get a slight performance boost, and that's typically what happens when you use something like Paketo build packs or Heroku or things like that, or Cloud Foundry, right? But the Paketo build packs is kind of the way of the future. It's the way that you can build applications and create images, layered images, where the stuff that changes fastest is in a separate layer than stuff that almost never changes, right? Your dependencies, your third-tier dependencies, so to speak. So I'm going to just do that. I actually do need to add something here to my build file to make this a little cleaner and easier for me to manage. So I go down here to my plugin right there. So, oops. And yeah, so I want to go here and add a configuration. Yep. Typing is a thing. Yeah, so I'm just going to add in the image name to where I have it in the proper format, or the format I preferred, I should say. And then what I want to do is do a Maven. Actually, I want to go out here and Maven Spring Boot plugin, and then just do a build image. And what this does is it goes through the build process, of course, but it also creates an OCI image, which you can run in Docker, and you can run this in Kubernetes. So this makes a very naturally deployable artifact to deploy and run your Spring Boot application using this. And we are at about a minute, so I'm not going to have time to actually run this for you, I don't think. Yeah, maybe. So let's go ahead and do this. So, and then I'll just wrap it up. Docker run name, and we'll call this our Omakase -p 8080 to 8080. Typing is just getting me here. So, Omakase -demo latest. Oh, Heckler Omakase. There we go. Actually works when you tell it the right stuff. Okay, so we're up and running. And let's see. So if I want to just do the supplier, of course it goes back to the default. And beverage name, beverage brew method. Boom. Okay. So with that, we are near the end. So let me go back here and give you the repo links. Here are the coordinates. By all means, again, follow me on Twitter at mkheck for any tips, updates, to reach out to me with any questions, comments, or feedback. If you want to know more about the Spring Boot book, there's the information, bit.ly.com/springbootbook or at springbootbook on Twitter. Please check out the repo, start the repo, watch it for any changes. That'll let you know when I make updates to it. But it's at just a repo called Properties under my GitHub account. With that, thank you so much for coming. Have a great day.